Donald is none of the things he claims to be. He's never been a billionaire. He might be now because of some of the things supported by his followers, but certainly at the time he left the presidency the first time, he was not and had not been a billionaire. He didn't actually give his paycheck over to the government every quarter as he promised. He all sorts of things about him. They're just lies, and he managed to sell them to people. And that's why I say Donald Trump is the greatest con artist in the history of the world.
Hello, and welcome to Eric McElroy's American Exchange with me, Eric McElroy. That's how it works. Welcome to the podcast. If you're coming back, welcome back. If you're here for the first time, welcome for the first time. This is the podcast where I dial across the pond from here in London to find out what is happening in my home country. And this week's guest gives brilliant insight into what is going on. It is David K. Johnston. He's a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's the founder and correspondent for DC Report, and he authored a number of books on Donald Trump, as well as a lot of other things. And his latest book was called The Big Cheat: How Donald Trump Fleeced America and Enriched Himself and His Entire Family. And he's also the recipient of something called the Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, I've heard of that. He was fascinating to talk to. He gives an insight into Donald Trump that I've only seen from Mary Trump, as far as long-term, knowing how Donald works, knowing how Donald ticks. We talk about why Donald is enamored of Putin, how the reporting of Donald has not always uncovered the things. Well, it's uncovered it, but whether or not it's been heard and listened to by the general public. So it's a really interesting conversation into what is happening with Donald and what is going to happen going forward with the Donald as well. So great conversation. Really appreciated him coming on. Please enjoy David K. Johnston. Oh, and if you're listening on YouTube, this is that time. I'm going to say it. Go ahead and subscribe, like the video, and share it. Do all those things that you can do to spread the podcast if you're enjoying these conversations. And here is David K. Johnston. I'm very excited to welcome to the podcast David K. Johnston. And the purpose of this podcast, David, is that I'm here in London. I've been here a long time, and I still care about America for some reason. I think it just can't get out of my blood, trying to figure out what is happening in my home country. And so I rely on good folk like yourself. So I want to start with a rating scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being America has become great, thanks to our new dear leader as of 1 month ago, or 10, we are basically screwed. Where do you think
Well,
we're at, David?
we're on the lower half of that scale, and it's getting worse.
Right.
These are what's happening to America today is stuff that I have been writing and warning about for decades. And there are a number of complex factors that lead to the reason that an utterly unqualified, appallingly ignorant, and mentally ill man is back in the White House. You should know in the audience, I've covered Donald Trump longer than anybody else since 1988. In fact, in July of that year, I wrote about for the first time anyone ever had about him becoming president. Wrote about it again in a book in 1992 called Temples of Chance, about the fraudulent way New Jersey casinos were being regulated. And Donald fits into these long-term structural changes in America. After World War II, up until about 1975, the American middle class and working classes did really well. Their incomes, in real terms, doubled.
Yeah.
The incomes of those at the very top grew very little. Because we had such high tax rates, we basically encouraged people to not take incomes of more than, in today's money, maybe $5 or $6 million a year. And we did also encourage tax shelters for people to get around those things.
Yeah.
Starting in 1973 was the peak year of income for the bottom 90% of Americans. And it began drifting downward. And this accelerated when Ronald Reagan became president, the only union president in the history of the country. He'd been head of the Screen Actors Guild. And he went after unions left and right and implemented a whole variety of policies that a recent study by RAND, which started out as an Air Force think tank, calculated resulted in $50 trillion being redistributed upward
Hmm.
from the vast majority of Americans to the top 10th or 100th of 1%, $50
Yeah.
trillion.
Okay.
I wrote a best-selling series of economics books about this, perfectly legal in 2003, which won the Investigative Book of the Year award, and showed how the tax system was a subsidy system for super wealthy people and companies that were positioned, and many of them actually make a profit off the income tax, if you
Mm.
understand what's going on. Free lunch, which was about all the hidden subsidies to companies that build their new facilities with your tax dollars instead of their own capital. And then the fine print, which was about all the efforts to suppress competition and get monopolies, duopolies, or triopolies, which enables raising prices and causes great economic damage. And as a result of this, most Americans in 2016, when Trump first won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote, they only got paid compared to 1973 through about Thanksgiving.
Hmm.
So they went 10% of the year almost with no income compared to 1973.
Right.
When you add in that in 1973, if you had health care, as most workers at large companies did, that was on top of your paycheck. Now it comes out of your paycheck. And that you had a pension in about 40% of the cases. That was on top of your pay. Now you save in a 401k plan or a similar plan out of your paycheck. People
Yeah.
really were only paid through about Thanksgiving. I'm sorry,
Mm.
about Halloween, the end of October.
Okay.
Now, most people have no idea that that's what's happening to them. Inflation changing numbers over time, and most
Mm.
people are enumerate. But I clearly documented this, and no one ever found any error in my books, even though they were widely denounced by a variety of critics who just made general complaints. And
Yeah.
my books champion competitive market capitalism per Adam Smith. One of the ways I was able to spot out critics who hadn't read the book is that they would accuse me of being anti-business and anti-capitalist. And I'd say, no, I'm pro-competition.
But
So
it's
Donald
some.
comes into this milieu and says, I alone can save you. I mean, he
Mhm.
poses as a savior. And people who don't know any better buy this argument. And keep in mind that more than 1 in 5 Americans reads at the level of 3rd grade or below, and more
Yeah.
than half read below 6th grade level. So we have a large population of people who lack critical thinking skills, never buy books, don't pay any attention to any serious issues. And Donald exploited that with his brilliant visceral appeals because he is, in my view, the greatest con artist in the history of the world.
Yeah. I would agree with that, even though, well, I mean, that you would think he would embrace that because he's always the greatest at everything. So that would be one thing that he would hold on to and at least be proud of.
Yeah,
I
not.
mean, yeah. I mean, I think for your critics to criticize you without reading your book is much faster to criticize someone without actually doing the reading. I mean, that
Yeah.
takes so much time. It's just
Yes.
easier to make shit up, which is what we do in the era of Trump.
Well, and which Donald in particular does. One of Donald's distinctive features is that he creates his own reality. Uh,
Yes.
Professor Timothy Snyder, the historian who's an expert on authoritarianism at Yale, has
Mm.
the same comment, different words. He says Donald lives in a fictional world in his head.
Yeah.
And what that means is that Donald will say something and 30 seconds later say the opposite and deny he ever said the first thing. And that's how he functions. And it's how he's always functioned throughout his life.
Well, I've had Mary Trump on the podcast, and she talks
Mhm.
about that. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
spoken to her, but
Oh,
she
yes.
basically
Many
says
times.
he was doing that to her in the family
Yeah.
context years before he was ever in the public eye the way he is now, and that
Yes. And he had
basic.
this monstrous father. A little story about his father.
Hmm.
There was a neighbor boy named Johnny Messer who went on to become the body man for New York Mayor Abe Beame. But when he was a little boy riding his bicycle on the sidewalk past the Trump house, because he lived a couple of doors down, a quarter fell out of his pocket just as Fred Trump pulled into the driveway of his home in his big Cadillac, El Dorado, I think it was called. And Johnny turned around to go back to get his money on his bicycle. And he goes, "Oh, hello, Mr. Trump," just as Father Trump bends down, picks up the quarter, holds it up, and says, "It's mine now." I mean, what kind of a person does this? Someone who there's no soul inside and everything's
Mm,
about money, getting the money, just not getting arrested. And that's how Donald Trump sees the world. He's a mercantilist, a pre Adam Smith mercantilist. If you have a piece of gold, Eric, and I
mm.
don't, well, there's no more wealth in the world. So the only thing I can do is attack you or your government to get that wealth.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing him do that now with things like his decision to absorb Greenland, which I know he kind of talked about at the end of his first administration, but it wasn't something he was running on, I believe, over the last 2 years. I didn't hear him
He
talking about
never he
Greenland.
never ran on that or Gaza or shutting down U.S. humanitarian aid or firing without cause large numbers of federal workers, which are going to have a serious negative impact on business.
Yeah. Ex going back to what you talked about, the people's awareness of income inequality. One of the things that I've suspected as a layman, as a clown, which is what I do most of the time, but it feels like the point where people in that middle class, especially the white middle class of America, that we keep hearing from politicians that Democrats have lost touch with. I think there's some truth to that. I also think that there's a narrative that Democrats have reinforced themselves by just believing it. But 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 regardless of that, I think the moment where that happened was in 2008 in the financial crisis, where for the first time that white middle class couldn't go buy the thing they needed, couldn't get the excess that they were used to having. And it was the first time that group of people went, "Oh, the game is rigged." Do you see that as an
Oh, no,
inflection
no,
point as
very much,
well?
very much. And that was a theme in my books that the game has
Mm,
been rigged and showing this and doing it in a way that anybody who got a high school diploma should have been able to understand my books.
yeah.
But that was the whole point. In fact, rigged was in the subtitle of one of my economics trilogy. And what happened in 2008 is uh, that came about because the George W. Bush administration stopped requiring underwriting of mortgage loans. They accepted the
Hmm.
argument that, hey, we're bankers. We wouldn't have all this money if we didn't know what we're doing. And they stopped underwriting mortgage loans. I wrote two pieces in 2004, making it eminently clear what was going on with housing prices couldn't continue. It had to
Hmm.
stop. There were others who understood it, but of course, Alan Greenspan, who was the head of the Fed and was the executor of the estate of Ayn Rand,
Hmm.
said nobody could have seen this coming. He didn't see it coming, and that's because he was willfully blind to what was coming. If
Yeah.
housing prices keep growing much faster than incomes, that's not sustainable. And when this hit ordinary people,
Hmm.
lost their homes
Yeah.
in many cases, lost their jobs, had their whole world upended. Many people haven't recovered. The uh, median net worth of households headed by a man, so that's usually a man and wife together, 35 and under, fell
Hmm.
essentially to zero.
Yeah.
They were just wiped out. And I don't expect people to understand the complex mechanisms that went on here. I mean, I wrote stories trying to break them down and show people,
Hmm.
but it did wake people up that things were not as they were. And the Democrats just did a terrible job of articulating what was happening. And they caved in on many issues because they depend on the same narrow pool of super wealthy Americans for donations.
Yeah.
Um, that is a secondary problem. After the Nixon scandals, and remember, Richard Nixon was a tax criminal who, but for a pardon, would have probably been convicted and might have gone to prison. His tax lawyer went to prison. These reforms were introduced. And
Hmm.
instead of making the system more transparent and reducing the influence of large donors, they boomeranged on people. They turned into doing the exact opposite. And I've interviewed over the years more than 100 members of Congress and the Senate about fundraising, and they all
Hmm.
hate it. Doesn't matter what their politics are. They feel demeaned, but they're also risk averse. They won't
Yeah.
change it.
But I mean, well, it would take an act of Congress to reverse Citizens United, which allowed companies to give whatever they want. Is that right? Because companies have a
Yes,
voice
and
in
the
cash
framers
or,
of our Constitution, this is among the things I taught when I was on the faculty at Syracuse University College of Law. I'm not a lawyer, but I taught law there for 15 years. The framers of our Constitution were deeply worried about structural corruption, institutional
mm,
corruption. They weren't so much worried about venality, which you will always have, but
yeah,
structures. And that's why they built the Constitution the way they did. And what we're seeing now is that Donald Trump just blithely ignores the law. In fact, he declared just the other day that anything a president does to save the country doesn't violate the law, which is utter and complete nonsense
yeah.
and is the language of a dictator.
Well, the Napoleon specifically, is that right? Or has that
Yes.
been attributed to
Well,
Napoleon?
not only
But
Napoleon, the Sun King, who said, I am the state.
yeah, of course. I mean, so we're only bizarrely, I mean, it feels like years, but we're a month into this administration. And we're at the cusp now where he's done some things and thrown it out there. And I've heard the Republicans on the talk show saying, well, he's just testing the bounds and the courts, and there's some courts that have put restraining orders on it. But now we're at the point where we're going to see if the administration actually follows the restraining orders. It feels to me that that is the point where, because the Republicans are so good at saying, oh, liberals are so wound up, they're so exaggerating, just wait, he's just, don't listen to what he says, blah blah blah, all that bullshit. But this is the point where it's going to become real. If he ignores the court orders, that pushes us through the line, doesn't it?
Well, there's plenty of evidence right now that they are ignoring the court orders, at least some of them. They haven't turned back on the spigots of money.
Yeah.
Look, I've warned people now for almost 10 years that Donald Trump wants to be our dictator.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, 2015, I had lots of nationally prominent journalists whom I know, say, you're really out there. That's nuts. And I'd say, you don't know the man like I do. You haven't spent all the hours I have with him and studying him. That's always been Trump's goal. Donald believes in his own mind that he's special, that he's the only person who could possibly be president. He no doubt believes he should really run the whole world. If he wasn't in the White House, I would tell you he had delusions of grandeur. But given that he's gotten to the White House twice, it's a little hard to sustain that. But his goal is very clear: to do whatever he thinks he should do and not be held accountable. And let's remember that in the first term, he said, "I have an Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution that says I can do anything I want." Well, it's not very long. Go read it. It says nothing of the sort.
Yeah, of course. But that's the curiosity of him in some ways. If he believes in himself so much and he wants to be dictator and all these things, why is he so enamored of people like Putin, for example?
Well, because Donald identifies with those people. First of all, Donald, because of the monster he had as a father, needs the approval of strong people, and he lives in fear of them. So he has this fear in the sense of fearing God.
Yeah.
And second, when they flatter him, if you flatter Donald, you can get all sorts of things. I mean, I've negotiated as a journalist with Donald many, many times, and never once did I come away with less than I was seeking, because I understood all I had to do was flatter him and make him think something nice. And then he gives away the store. When he hired the writer Tony Schwartz to write The Art of the Deal, which is really one fraud after another described in his book. I mean, he describes him as a fraudster.
Yeah.
He said, what do you want? Now, the normal fee back then would have been, for somebody of Tony's skill level, $30,000 or $50,000 and maybe $1,000 a week for every week you're on the New York Times bestseller list. Well, Tony said half the royalties. And Donald said, okay. Tony's a very, very wealthy man today, and he stopped taking the royalties for himself when Donald got in the White House. But he's a very wealthy man today because Donald is a terrible negotiator. He claims to be this great businessman. He's not. He's a cash extractor who, with every business he got into, with a single exception, Trump University, that was a complete fraud, he never had any money invested. In his first Atlantic City casino, he borrowed all of his stake, took a multi-million-dollar fee off the top, and was in a negative position. And the same with the next two casinos. That's how he does business. And the way to think about him is he's more like a mob bust out. keep taking money out of the enterprise until it's going to collapse. Then you hurry up taking money out of it and you let it collapse and you walk away. In his case, instead of hiding it, you walk away and say, what a genius I was. I got out at the right time. I'm sorry, there are casinos in Atlantic City making very nice profits to this day.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess taking that, that would mean, which is almost scarier, that it's not that Putin has something on Donald, it's that Donald admires him, wants his attention, and wants to be like him.
Yes, but both can be true.
That,
Donald, the old Soviet started courting Donald in 1987. And look, all around the world, governments court people they think can
yeah.
be useful to them in the future. And they started courting Donald. When Trump Tower opened, technically in November of 83, but in 1984, there were all sorts of criminals who showed up wanting to buy apartments because, unlike all but one other luxury high rise in New York, they could purchase without a background check, without having to go before a co-op board. And one guy showed up to buy 5 apartments, literally with grocery bags of cash. And they paid premium prices. And so Donald, if you said, well, Donald will say, how do you want this apartment titled? We'll put it in the name of Snow Inc. Oh, is that a ski resort in Aspen? Or is that a cocaine trafficking business? Donald wouldn't ask that question. He wouldn't care. He just
yeah.
wanted the money.
Wow. I mean, do you think that, I mean, I guess what would Putin have on Trump? Because he is shameless. He seems to get away with everything. I mean, what could be there?
Well, let me tell you something that's been in my books that Putin certainly knows about. It may not be typical, but to tell you how little people know. For
Hmm.
a decade, Donald Trump was involved up to his eyeballs with one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America, a twice convicted felon who was Donald's personal pilot in his helicopter he used for publicity, the Ivana, who supplied the helicopters for Donald's casinos through a tiny little company that was financed by New Jersey industrial development bonds and involved all sorts of people who were mobbed up. When this guy got caught by the Drug Enforcement Administration, he wrote a confession. I have it in my files. The mules who drove drugs from Miami, Florida up to Cincinnati got 20 years in prison just for driving drugs. That's all they did.
Jeez.
They just drove. What did Donald's friend get? Well, Donald wrote a letter to a judge saying, Joe Wexelbaum's a stand-up guy and he shouldn't serve any time. He's a credit to the community. That's one reading of the letter. The other way to read the letter is, hey, Joe, keep your mouth shut and I will take care of you. Well, he served, the case then was mysteriously transferred from Ohio to the New Jersey federal courtroom of a newly appointed judge, Marianne Trump Berry, Donald's sister. Now, she dropped the case, but imagine for a moment, Eric, you're the chief judge, and she comes and says, well, I fly in this man's helicopters all the time. My husband flies in them weekly. He's personally been the pilot, and he's one of the biggest drug dealers in America, drug traffickers in America. So he served 18 months. That's all. He, when he got out, said, I don't have any money to pay my fine. He paid 3 $200 payments against $30,000, but he had to have a job. He went back to work for Donald, and he moved into a multi-million-dollar apartment, double apartment in Trump Tower with no mortgage underwriting. I think he got taken care of.
I mean, there's nothing suspicious in what you've said there whatsoever.
Everything I just told you, Eric, is in the public record, every single thing. And yet the New York Times, where I was an investigative reporter for many years, the Washington Post, AP, the Guardian, none of them will touch this.
Why?
I don't know. It is a complete mystery to me as somebody, and I've been at this almost 60 years now. I started out when I was a teenager doing investigative reporting, and well, still a teenager. I was a front page staff writer at the San Jose Mercury, now the 6th largest paper in America. And nobody, I mean, there are lots of other things, applying 12-year-old children with liquor and limousines because they had money to gamble and cheating all sorts of workers. And none of this happens. Partly, the New York Times normally would scrub a candidate for president. So Penny Scott, a reporter, was sent to Indonesia to find the kindergarten pals of Barack Obama, and to Hawaii to find the boys in high school he sat around smoking grass with.
Yep.
No scrub was made of Donald Trump. And when I raised this in the 2016 campaign with one of my former editors, what I got was everybody knows who Donald is. And I said, no, and meaning about his negatives. And I said, no,
Yeah.
everybody in Manhattan knows. People in
Mm.
Keokuk, Iowa think he's a business genius.
Yeah. I mean, I guess going back to 2015, no one thought he would win. I mean, there
I
were so
did.
many candidates.
Oh, no,
You
I
did.
did. I literally, on the day he came down the escalator and the people who were applauding him turned out to be paid actors, $50 each.
Yep.
I had he had run in 2011,
Hmm.
2012, and only two national journalists in the U.S., Lawrence O'Donnell, MSNBC, and me, said he's not running. He's running for a new contract with NBC, and he wants more money.
Yeah.
And I I would tell this to political reporters I know, and they'd tell me, no, 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 he's running. And then he
Hmm.
dropped out, and they all had egg on their face. So when he ran in 2015, I immediately realized he had made these people look like fools. They would dismiss this as they did as a vanity project, and he
Yep.
was going to get in there. And a part of the reason, frankly, was there's an episode of The West Wing that talks about how did Jed Bartlett, the fictional president, get to the White House?
Hmm.
Well, he picked people off one at a time, and that's what I saw Donald. And I literally dropped what I was doing. I was writing a book proposing a new federal tax system that's inexpensive, cheat proof, fair, meets all the historic standards of a tax system. And I'm only just now picking it back up because I knew I needed to focus on Donald because I knew he would not get the kind of coverage that was needed.
Hmm.
But I couldn't break through any of the big organizations. I got published in various secondary places, including once he took office, we created DC Report, where many of the biggest
Hmm.
Trump stories were broken, but nobody knows that because, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, when we did that, would take our work but not credit us.
Right. Uh, well, I mean, I've given up on. I mean, it's impossible. It's so hard to give up on all of the people that have, kissed the ring now because I love my iPhone and Amazon Prime is so helpful. It's.
Well,
I
one
mean, there's
thing
so
people
many things
shouldn't,
to walk away from.
Eric, one thing people shouldn't do is stop the news just because it hasn't been what I think it should be. If
Yeah.
you stop paying attention to the news, Donald wins.
Oh, not paying attention, but supporting places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, or
If
but
you
going
don't
to
support
places
them, they
like,
won't have the money to do the work. And they've done a lot of good work. They just haven't done what I think they should have done. But
yeah.
if Donald wins, I mean, remember the old Soviet,
Mm.
and what Solzhenitsyn said about them. Uh, we know they're lying. They know we know they're lying. We know they know that we know that they're lying. You still have to pay attention to what's
Yes,
happening.
of
And
course.
and if you stop doing that, and lots of people just cancel their subscriptions and tuned out, well, that's just turning things over to Donald and his group of usurpers.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, I mean, I'm not tuned, I guess I'm not tuned out, but I'm trying to find other places to go, like DC Report and other
Sure.
places. But I agree, probably the average person, because this is my core interest area, but the average person is just tuning out. And you're right, that is dangerous. And that's exactly what they want. They want us numbed in submission. Um, so do you think that the fascination from Putin then, is that what transfers over to Musk?
Yes, in many ways. I also suspect there's something else going on here. Donald has not filed his required Office of Government Ethics forms.
Right.
Now, the ones he filed in the past were full of nonsense valuations and things like that. But it, Donald's history with someone like Elon, especially after the cover of, I think it was Time, but whatever
It
magazine
was,
put
yeah, time.
Elon Musk behind the Resolute desk, would be to get rid of them.
Yep.
So I suspect whether it's formal or informal, that Donald is in hock to Elon. Remember,
Mm.
he owes more than $500 million now with interest in the New York civil case. That's a state case. And
Yep.
he owes E. Jean Carroll 88.3 million plus interest. So by now it's approaching, if it hasn't passed, $100 million. So there's $600 million plus that he's in hock for. And Elon Musk may be the person who he's counting on to take
Mm.
care of him. Um, but the fact that he has this fictional government agency, newspapers keep reporting in TV and
Yep.
radio, the Department of Efficiency, of Government Efficiency, excuse me, there is no such department. This is another
Yep.
fiction. and it shouldn't be treated as such. It should be the fictional or non-existent or imaginary Doge.
Yeah. No, it's insane that it's gotten the traction it has when it doesn't exist. You can't just make up a department. That's not how the U.S. government works.
And similarly, you can't just destroy a government agency or refuse to spend the money. When
Yep.
Nixon was president, he tried to impound money. This was all litigated. The U.S. Supreme Court said no,
Hmm.
because under the U.S. constitutional scheme, Article 1 is Congress.
Yeah.
Congress has the power. Congress passes the laws. Congress raises the money. Congress spends the money. And the president is limited to carrying out the orders of the Congress and being commander in chief of the military. I mean, in many ways, he's a high paid, a powerful errand boy for Congress.
Yeah.
And people don't know that. I mean, I've had students, not third year law students when I was teaching them, but undergraduates taking a pre-law course I taught, who did not understand how a bill becomes a law. They just thought it's by edict, because we're doing a terrible job in America, not only of teaching reading, but of the constitutional law and the principles of American democracy.
But is it, I don't want to, is it laziness in journalism that they're not labeling it what it is, or is it fear, or?
Well, I have made it a point my whole career to break stories in Washington without ever living there. So there, as you can imagine, lots of Washington career journalists who don't like me for that reason. I enjoy embarrassing those folks. And the problem is that most Washington journalism, and the reason I would never live there, is based on access to people,
Yeah.
getting quotes from people, instead of doing what I like, which is to study the public record, to find the regulation, the rule. When I write about a bill that's becoming law, I actually read the bill, or at least the
Oh dear.
portions of it. If it's 1,000 pages long, I'm going to write about. And so my stories would be different. And I had many experiences at the LA Times, the New York Times, not at the Philadelphia Inquirer, but at those two papers, where an editor would say, well, everybody else is saying something different. And I would say, well, here's the portion of the statute or the bill they're not quoting, because they're working off talking points memos.
Yeah.
And it's a real fundamental problem. And then, at the end of the day, Washington is a small community. London, where you live, at the end of the day, is a small community.
Yeah.
People have to know each other. The kids go to school with each other. So they have to get along. I have the benefit of being in Rochester, New York, an hour's flight away, and I don't get the inside color in a lot of things, but I do get substance that often Washington bureau reporters do not.
Yeah, I suppose I think, well, I know for a lot of them, I know there's the access journalism is a big deal. It's an issue in the UK. I'm sure it's an issue in the US as well. I'm conscious of time.
Eric, very few journalists understand law deeply. I'm not a lawyer, but I knew it well enough to teach it for 15 years at a law school. They're innumerate. Innumeracy is just rampant among journalists all over the world. But in the U.S. and Britain particularly, and very few have confidence in their own ability to say this is news. I mean, once I would figure out something is news, George W. Bush, the day after he came into office, a bill was introduced on his behalf that would have allowed the richest people in America to never pay income taxes again. I figured it out, went to my editors, and an editor said, well, we can't quote you. You can't be the source of this. And I said, why not? I'll describe it. And they went, no, you have to find. So I found within a couple of days, a very famous, deeply respected tax lawyer, known for both exposing sham tax shelters and making sham tax shelters. And we quoted him on the front page of the New York Times, whereupon the George W. Bush White House quietly walked away from this, and nobody followed up. So it's this tendency to rely not just on sources, but to not have the confidence to come to your own judgment. Of course, if you do that, you put your career on the line every time you do that. You've got to be right, or you're over.
Well, I've got being right. I mean, yes, but that seems like the core of journalism, is that kind of research that you would talk about and that in-depth looking at it. I'm conscious of time, and I really appreciate you talking to me. This has been fascinating. The last thing I guess I want to ask you is the the incredible length of time that you've known Donald, and I have so many questions about what it's like to be around him in person. What do you, because there's a huge, he's done a frenetic pace starting off this month. It seems nonstop. Is that physically and mentally sustainable for him? And I mean, where do you see things? How do you see this moving forward from here? There's so
Well,
much happening at
yeah.
once.
Donald, who's not in good physical health,
Mm,
is a very lazy guy. During the 16 campaign, he disappeared from the campaign trail for days at a time, and nobody took note of that. But they all covered when Hillary Clinton, from exhaustion and being
yeah.
ill, briefly collapsed. Um, this is not being done by Donald. In the first
Mm,
administration, he didn't expect to win. He'd done no preparation.
yeah.
And so he got a hodgepodge of people, some of whom put brakes on him. This time around, he anointed Project 2025 when it started. You can get a video of him, Eric, in which he says, "These are my people and this will be my
Yeah.
administration." And then on the campaign trail said two contradictory things. I've never heard of this thing. I don't want to know about it. And well, there are parts of it I like and parts of it I don't. And nobody
Yeah.
called him out about what is obviously inconsistent and
Mm,
irreconcilable. This time he's got dedicated zealots and he's putting them in office. Kash Patel at the FBI, the utterly corrupt Pam Bondi as Attorney General, Russell Vogt, particularly important at the very powerful Office of Management and Budget. And some of these people will also be good managers. So
mm,
they're doing the lifting. If you watch the YouTubes of Donald Trump signing executive orders, you will see that he's handed orders and he doesn't know what they are. And
yeah.
then sometimes when he describes them, that's not right. He's just going through the motions. And Donald's life experience would be most people aren't paying that kind of attention. I mean, when did ABC, CBS, or NBC and its nightly newscast open with Donald Trump signed an executive order today, which his own words show he has no idea what it does?
Yeah.
Did they put it 15 minutes into the show even? No, nobody did that. So the issue that will be faced is, will the court say you have to follow the law? Congress makes the rules. You have discretion, but it's not unlimited.
Yeah.
If they're telling you to spend money, you have to spend the money. You can't ignore violations of the law. You have some discretion. You can prosecute or not prosecute. But the oath of office says that you will faithfully
Mm,
execute the office of president. And Donald Trump is faithlessly doing so. Um, and the likely thing that will disrupt this is the tariffs he's putting in place, which are really a scheme to raise not just the cost of imported goods, but domestic goods of the same kind.
mm,
Because if you're a manufacturer, you're going to raise your price to just below the tariffed price. It's a scheme to
yeah.
redistribute even more up. The shutting down of AID, which is not charity. It's an American jobs program. We hire Americans to grow food and make
Mm,
medicine, supply computers as part of our humanitarian aid. And other actions are going to damage the economy.
mm,
And that's when we're likely to see some kickback from the people who said, well, wait a minute, you said on day one egg prices would go down and you were going to lower grocery bills. And now you're saying, well, it's hard to do that. And these are inherently damaging actions. Millions of Americans simply reject that 16 million jobs were created in 4 years by Joe Biden,
yeah.
when in the last 30 years under Republicans, there were 1 million jobs. In 30 years, the Republicans were in office about half the time, 1 million jobs. He did 16 million in 4 years. They just say it's made up. It's not true. At some point, economic reality should cause some people in the Donald is our savior crowd to begin questioning that.
Mm,
And when and if that happens, it will be very powerful if it's large enough, because as George Lakoff, the cognitive scientist, teaches, people respond to either a mother figure or a father figure. Mother figures are nurturing, clearly not Donald. Father figures are stern and demanding. But if you break with the father figure, the break
mm,
much more serious and thorough than if you break with the mother figure. So I expect there is the opportunity for people to come to their senses but it's going to take some real bad economic and possibly another pandemic, of which there's a huge risk because we had corralled some super deadly viruses like Marburg through our humanitarian programs. If you stop giving those people medicine and food and other care, the virus will break out of the corral and it will hopscotch on jetliners around the world, and people will start dying. Remember the MERS virus? 1 in 3 people died who got MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. So this will take time, and it may fail. Donald may by then fire enough generals and admirals and promote out of order junior officers who will be loyal to him, that his takeover and dictatorship will be complete. And the only way then to get rid of it is going to be through violence. And I hope not to see that. And I hope none of my children, grandchildren, or my step-great-grandchild live to see that.
Yeah, well, definitely not. And I think it's fascinating that basically I feel the same as what after I talked with Mary Trump, is that we are now all just in this gigantic dysfunctional family with an abusive father, stepfather figure, and that's what it's going to be.
Appallingly ignorant. I mean, Donald had to be told what happened on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. He didn't know. Donald claims to be the world's greatest expert on 22 subjects. One of those subjects, one of those subjects is taxes, which I have a global reputation on. I've lectured about taxes on every continent except Antarctica. Penguins don't pay taxes. And Donald was asked under oath once, what do you know about accounting? I don't know anything about accounting. And for page after page of the transcript, they tie him down that he knows nothing about accounting.
Yeah.
You don't know accounting, you can't know tax. I had to learn accounting well enough. I taught in a graduate accounting school for 8 years. I couldn't have broken the stories I did in the New York Times without learning accounting. Horrible thing to have to do, by the way. I don't recommend it. But it's all a fraud. Donald is none of the things he claims to be. You know, he's never been a billionaire. He might be now because of some of the things supported by his followers, but certainly at the time he left the presidency the first time, he was not and had not been a billionaire. He didn't actually give his paycheck over to the government every quarter as he promised. All sorts of things about him. They're just lies, and he managed to sell them to people. And that's why I say Donald Trump is the greatest con artist in the history of the world.
Well, we will give him that. Thank you for coming on, David. It's been really fascinating talking to you. I really appreciate it.
Take care, Eric.
There we go. That was David K. Johnston, professor at Rochester Institute of Technology, Pulitzer Prize winner, author, and just all-around knowledgeable person on all things Trump and more. Just a great conversation, all kinds of little insight and details that I didn't know before, and also, you know, where things may be turning and where we're going to be knowing in the next few days if Donald Trump pushes through the court's decisions on how they hold him to account and whether this is the dictatorship that Trump always wanted. God help us all. So thank you so much to David for taking the time to come on the podcast. Thank you to Mark, the producer, for putting everything together. And thank you to you, of course, dear listener and viewer, for watching. And please make sure to share, like, subscribe, give us a review, do all those kinds of things that you know you need to do already, but I remind you anyway, because that's what we do in these formats. But thank you very much, David, and we'll talk to you again, everyone else. Goodbye.